Well, you talked about how the main aim was to stop any kind of possibility of resistance. What about, well, the only kind of resistance that we ever hear about are the rocket attacks. What are any other forms of Palestinian local resistance that you know of, and how threatening is that to them?
Oh, there's a lot of it. It's very threatening. What worries them most is nonviolent resistance, and that's put down very brutally. There's been a lot of it. A lot of it is around the building of the walls, another criminal activity, as the World Court reaffirmed a couple of years ago. And there has been very impressive nonviolent resistance, much of it around the village of Bilin, but other places too. And it has had support from Israelis. One of the main groups actually is now touring the United States. They're called Anarchists Against the Wall, who join in nonviolent protests to try to stop the building of the wall, which is destroying villages, separating people from their lands, and so on, and against, of course, violation of law. And Israel's response to this has been very harsh. It even got to the extent of shooting a Nobel Prize laureate, Madrid McGuire. But it rarely gets reported here, but there's a fair amount of it, and they don't tolerate it. And as long as the U.S. supports it, they'll go on.
Speaking of U.S. support, you wrote decades ago that U.S. support of Israel has more to do with domestic problems here than with local or regional problems of the Middle East. Is this still the case, and what are the domestic problems that you were referring to?
I think that comment probably had to do with support for Israel on the part of educated intellectuals in the United States. Their support dates from 1967, including Jewish intellectuals. Before that, Israel wasn't much of an issue. But after the Israeli victory in 67, there was a virtual love affair of the educated intellectuals in the United States with Israel, and I think that had mostly to do with domestic issues. I've written about it and can go through it, but they finally had a way to. It's at that point that the Israeli-U.S. alliance was established. So you're now in a position where you can support U.S. power, which is a wonderful thing. You can give open support to the success of violence against third world people. Remember, that was the time when the U.S. was failing to do so effectively in Vietnam. But here you can support it. And you can support violence while pretending to have humanitarian goals. That's an irresistible combination. It was also used very effectively by people like Irving Howe and others as a weapon against the hated New Left by charging them with with complete whole series of fabrications and deceit, charging them with being not supportive of Israel. There's some ugly examples in print. But anyway, that was a combination, and I think that stayed. On the other hand, the governments, the support for Israel by the government and by the corporate sector is based on regional issues. I mean, Israel is simply regarded as a very valuable client state in the region. You can see it right now. So investment in Israel by U.S. high-tech firms, Microsoft, Intel, and so on, is significantly increasing. It's also reversing. So some of Israel's military industry is shifting many of its activities to the United States, so they can gain from better marketing possibilities. They can get U.S. subsidies and others. But it's a very closely integrated relationship, just at the straight economic level. And Israel is regarded by the United States as essentially a military base. I mean, right in the middle of the Gaza war, the Pentagon announced large shipments of arms to Israel. Well, a few questions were raised about that during the war, but the Pentagon pointed out correctly that the arms are not intended for the use of Israelis against Gaza relation to U.S. goals often brings enormous instability, but it's still called stability. So yes, it's a military base. It's an intelligence center. Relations between U.S. and Israeli intelligence are very close. And so it got on across the board. It's a valuable client state. In contrast, Palestinians offer nothing to the U.S. They're weak, they're powerless, they don't have resources, they're friendless, so they don't have any rights. I mean, it's as simple as that.
And these different domains of supporters of Israel, you also wrote around the same time that the people who call themselves supporters of Israel are in reality supporters of its moral degeneration and probable ultimate destruction. Can you explain what you mean?
Well, I think the support for Israel is enabling it to carry out policies which are criminal, which are increasingly unacceptable to the world at large. They're turning themselves into a pariah state which can survive and maintain its actions only with the backing of the United States for ugly reasons. By now it's regarded throughout the world as one of the most dangerous states in the world. Recent polls show that. And it's even losing its support among especially younger American Jews whose liberal values are inconsistent with the actions that they see in front of them. So it's leading to their moral degradation. I think I wrote that 30 years ago, and it's been more and more clear since, and very possible ultimate destruction. I mean, if the United States decides to join the world on this topic instead of blocking a political settlement, Israel would be in great trouble unless it agreed to join the world as well.
Before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and come home to my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I be a